They dragged her to the iron gates in heavy chains, an Omega, sacrificed to a monster. King Roderick was universally known as the Mad Alpha, a beast who supposedly shredded his brides. But when the heavy chamber doors locked behind her that night, the true monster wasn't the king. It was the terrifying secret he guarded. The freezing winds of the northern reaches howled like tormented spirits, biting violently through the thin, tattered fabric of Isolde Harrington's cloak. She sat trembling in the back of the iron-reinforced carriage, her wrists bound by heavy, silver-plated cuffs that burned her delicate skin. At 21, Isolde was an Omega of the Silverpine Pack, a status that should have guaranteed her protection, warmth, and a cherished place within her family's estate. Instead, she had been reduced to currency. A sacrificial lamb offered up to slaughter, traded away by her own flesh and blood to satisfy the bloodlust of a tyrant. Opposite her sat Beta Cedric, her father's most trusted enforcer. His cruel, scarred face was illuminated by the flickering glow of the carriage lantern. A sickeningly smug grin twisted his lips as he watched Isolde shiver. He leaned forward, the leather of his armor creaking loudly in the cramped space. "Try not to look so miserable, little Omega," Cedric sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are serving a grand purpose for the Silverpine Pack. Your father, Lord Reginald, will be hailed as a hero for securing the border treaties. All it cost was one useless, weak daughter." Isolde refused to give him the satisfaction of her tears. She kept her gaze fixed on the frosted window, staring out into the endless expanse of dying pine trees and jagged snow-covered rocks. The betrayal of her father, Lord Reginald, was a wound far deeper than the chafing silver around her wrists. When the summons had arrived from the Obsidian Crags demanding a noble bride for the Mad Alpha King, the entire continent had held its breath in terror. King Roderick's reputation preceded him. Tales of his madness were whispered by the firesides of every pack in the realm. It was said that the king had lost his mind to a blood curse 5 years ago, transforming him into a feral, uncontrollable beast. 3 noble brides had been sent to his fortress in the past 2 years. None had survived their first month. They had been returned to their families in sealed, lead-lined coffins. Lord Reginald, ever the opportunistic coward, had seen the royal decree not as a tragedy, but as a golden opportunity. Instead of sacrificing his prized alpha sons or his favored beta daughters, he had dragged Isolde from her quarters in the dead of night. She had been given no time to pack, no time to say goodbye to the few servants who had shown her kindness. She was simply thrown into the carriage, a treaty document pinned to her chest like a shipping manifest. "He will tear you apart, you know," Cedric continued, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather, rather than her impending brutal murder. "They say the Mad King doesn't even use his human form anymore. He remains shifted, pacing his halls, waiting for fresh meat. I almost pity you, Isolde. Almost. If you pity me, Cedric, then unlock these cuffs and let me run," Isolde whispered, her voice raspy and dry. Cedric laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "And face Lord Reginald's wrath, or worse, King Roderick's army, no. You are going to the Dreadfort, and you will do your duty. You will walk into the beast's den, and you will die for your family." The carriage suddenly lurched to a violent halt, throwing Isolde forward against the iron grates of the cabin. The howling wind outside seemed to amplify, carrying with it the undeniable heavy scent of dark pine old blood and ozone. It was an alpha's scent so overwhelmingly potent that Isolde's Omega instincts screamed at her to submit to curl into a ball and hide. She slowly raised her head and looked out the carriage window. Rising from the jagged cliffs like a jagged black tooth against the stormy night sky was the Dreadfort, King Roderick's stronghold. It was a terrifying monolith of dark stone iron spikes and towering battlements. There were no warm fires glowing in the windows, no banners flying in the courtyard. It looked less like a royal palace and more like a massive, inescapable tomb. The carriage doors were wrenched open from the outside. Two massive guards bearing the crest of the Blood Moon Pack, a red wolf howling against a shattered moon, reached in and hauled Isolde out by her arms. Her boots hit the frozen cobblestones, and her knees immediately buckled. The cold was absolute, seeping into her very marrow. "We have the tribute." One of the Blood Moon guards rumbled, his eyes glowing a faint, dangerous yellow in the darkness. He tossed a heavy leather pouch of gold coins to Cedric. "The treaty is sealed. The Silverpine Pack's borders will remain untouched by the king's armies. Now leave before the scent of your fear agitates the king." Cedric snatched the gold, his eyes wide with nervous urgency. He didn't even cast a backward glance at Isolde as he scrambled back into the carriage, shouting at the driver to whip the horses. Isolde watched the carriage disappear into the blizzard, taking her last connection to her old life with it. She was utterly alone. "Move, Omega!" The second guard growled, shoving her roughly toward the gaping maw of the fortress. Isolde stumbled forward, her bare feet numb against the frost. The interior of the Dreadfort was cavernous, draughty, and eerily silent. Shadows danced along the vaulted stone ceilings, cast by the sparse, sputtering torches mounted on the walls. The air was thick with tension and the overwhelming, terrifying scent of a predator operating on the very edge of sanity. As she was marched up the grand winding staircase toward the royal wing, Isolde braced her heart. She was an exiled Omega, stripped of her pack, her family, and her dignity. But as the iron-bound doors to the king's chambers loomed ahead, a strange, quiet resolve settled over her. If she was to die tonight in the jaws of a madman, she would not do so weeping. She would face the beast with her eyes wide open. The royal guards did not follow Isolde into the chambers. They shoved her roughly through the doorway, unclasped the heavy silver cuffs from her bruised wrists, and pulled the massive oak doors shut behind her. The definitive echoing clack of the heavy iron deadbolt sliding into place sounded exactly like a death knell. She was locked in. There was no escape. Isolde stood frozen near the entryway, her chest heaving as she desperately tried to calm her racing heart. The royal bedchamber was massive, larger than the entire ground floor of her father's manor. Heavy velvet curtains, dark as dried blood, covered the towering windows, shutting out the violent blizzard raging outside. A massive four-poster bed sat in the center of the room, draped in furs, but it looked entirely untouched. The only light came from a massive stone fireplace on the far wall, where a meager fire desperately struggled against the damp, oppressive chill of the room. But it wasn't the cold that made Isolde tremble. It was the scent. The air was thick, nearly suffocating, heavily saturated with the scent of dark pine petrichor and something distinctly metallic and wrong. It was the pheromones of a profoundly distressed alpha. Beneath the natural, powerful musk of the king, there was an acrid, bitter undertone that burned the back of Isolde's throat. It smelled like sickness. It smelled like rotting magic. Before she could process the strange scent, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, rattling the soles of her feet. Isolde spun around, pressing her back against the heavy wooden doors, her breath catching in her throat. From the darkest shadowed corner of the room, movement stirred. The sound of heavy, agonizingly slow footsteps echoed across the stone floor. Thud, drag, thud, drag. Then King Roderick stepped into the dim light of the dying fire. The breath was completely knocked out of Isolde's lungs. The rumors had not exaggerated his monstrous presence. The king was a behemoth of a man, towering easily over 6.5 feet tall, his shoulders impossibly broad. He was shirtless, his heavily muscled torso covered in a chaotic web of vicious, jagged scars that looked as though he had been repeatedly torn open and stitched back together by a madman. His dark hair was long matted, with sweat hanging in wild curtains over his face. But it was his eyes that paralyzed her. They were glowing. Not the natural golden luminescence of a stable alpha wolf, but a fractured, sickly blood-red hue that violently flickered and pulsed with erratic energy. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a thin line of dark blood trickled down his chin from where his elongated razor-sharp fangs had pierced his own lip. This was the Mad King, the beast who slaughtered his brides. Roderick let out another rumbling growl, his massive hands curling into fists. Thick, deadly claws extended from his fingertips, scraping violently against the stone floor, sending a shower of orange sparks into the air. He locked his burning red eyes onto Isolde. He took a heavy, lumbering step toward her. The predatory intent rolling off him was an overwhelming physical force that drove Isolde to her knees. Her Omega instincts, designed to pacify and submit, were completely short-circuiting under the sheer magnitude of his deranged aura. "Please," Isolde whispered, her voice barely a breath. She squeezed her eyes shut, tilting her neck in ultimate submission, exposing her throat. She waited for the agonizing tear of teeth, the blinding flash of pain, the end of her tragic, miserable life. She heard him close the distance. She felt the impossible radiating heat of his massive body looming directly over her. She heard the ragged, wet sound of his breathing, heavy and erratic, like a dying animal, taking its final gasps. But the fatal strike never came. Instead, a deafening, agonizing roar of pure, unfiltered torment shattered the silence of the room. It wasn't a roar of anger. It was a scream of unbearable pain. Isolde flinched, snapping her eyes open, just in time to see the colossal, terrifying monster of a king violently collapse. Roderick's knees hit the stone floor with a sickening crack right in front of her. His massive hands flew to his chest, his claws digging viciously into his own pectoral muscles as he convulsed. The terrifying blood-red glow in his eyes wildly flickered, suddenly shifting to a desperate, clear, startlingly beautiful shade of amber before flashing back to feral red. "Out!" Roderick choked the word tearing from his throat like gravel. His voice was shockingly human, laced with an agonizing desperation. "Get out! Run!" Isolde was paralyzed with shock. This wasn't a bloodthirsty monster preparing to feast. This was a man violently fighting a war inside his own body. Roderick pitched forward, his massive forehead crashing into the stone floor, mere inches from Isolde's trembling knees. As he fell, the firelight illuminated his broad, scarred back, and Isolde finally saw the source of the bitter metallic scent. Driven deeply into the flesh along his spine were 3 thick, jagged shards of solid black iron, but the veins surrounding the wounds were glowing with a toxic, sickly silver luminescence. Isolde and Omega, trained in the ancient medicinal arts of the Silverpine healers, instantly recognized the horrific sight. It wasn't a blood curse. It wasn't a natural madness. King Roderick was being systematically, maliciously poisoned. Someone had embedded silver-laced wolfsbane directly into his spinal column. The metal was slowly, agonizingly severing the connection between his human consciousness and his inner wolf, forcing the animal to take over in a state of permanent, blinding agony. The horrific realization washed over her like ice water. The brides hadn't been killed by a monster. They had been collateral damage in a political assassination attempt orchestrated from within his own inner circle. Roderick let out a whimpering, pitiful sound that broke Isolde's heart. His massive hand, trembling violently, reached out across the stone, his bloodied claws stopping an inch from the hem of her tattered dress. "Mate!" The Alpha's inner wolf whined through Roderick's lips, the red fading from his eyes completely replaced by the profound, soul-deep amber of absolute recognition. Isolde gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The Mad King wasn't just poisoned. He was her fated mate, and she was the only one in the kingdom who knew exactly how to save him. The revelation hung in the freezing, damp air of the royal bedchamber, heavier than the iron doors that locked them inside. Mate. The word echoed in Isolde's mind, a cruel twist of destiny that bound her, an exiled Omega, to the most feared Alpha on the continent. King Roderick lay gasping on the cold stone floor, his massive frame shuddering violently as the toxic silver luminescence pulsed across his heavily scarred back. Isolde's fear evaporated instantly, replaced by a fierce ancient instinct deeply woven into her Omega biology. The urge to nurture, to protect, and to heal her mate surged through her veins, overriding every rational thought that told her to run. She dropped to her knees beside him. Up close, the damage was horrifyingly precise. The 3 black iron shards had been driven directly into his lower cervical and upper thoracic vertebrae. It was a calculated surgical strike. Whoever had done this possessed intimate knowledge of werewolf anatomy, likely mimicking the forbidden techniques detailed in the restricted anatomical journals of Grand Maester Godwyn, a text Isolde had secretly studied in her youth. "Roderick," Isolde whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. She tentatively placed her small, trembling hand over his massive, heavily muscled shoulder. The Alpha flinched violently at her touch, a guttural snarl tearing from his throat, but his amber eyes immediately locked onto hers, filled with a desperate, silent plew. He was fighting the feral instincts of his inner wolf with every ounce of his remaining sanity. The scent of rotting magic and burning silver was overpowering. "I know it hurts," she murmured purposefully, releasing her Omega pheromones. Instead of the sharp, acidic scent of terror, she flooded the space around them with the calming, sweet aroma of crushed lavender and fresh rain. The physiological response was instantaneous. Roderick's ragged breathing slowed marginally, and the terrifying claws that had been gouging deep grooves into the stone floor slowly retracted. "I have to pull them out," Isolde stated firmly. "The silver-laced wolfsbane is entering your central nervous system. If it reaches your brainstem, you will never shift back to your human mind. You will be permanently lost." Roderick ground his teeth together, the muscles in his jaw ticking. He gave a single jerky nod. "Do it!" He rasped his voice, vibrating with agony. Isolde scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the massive, shadowy room. She needed tools. Bare hands would not provide enough leverage to extract the deeply embedded metal, and touching the toxic silver directly would severely burn her. She rushed to the massive stone fireplace, where a set of heavy wrought-iron fire tongs rested against the hearth. Grabbing them, she then tore a long strip of clean linen from the untouched bed sheets, soaking it in a basin of cold water, resting on a nearby washstand. Returning to the fallen king, Isolde knelt down, positioning herself directly beside his heavily scarred torso. "You need to stay as still as possible," she instructed, her tone shifting from that of a terrified captive to an authoritative healer. "If you thrash, the jagged edges of the iron will sever your spinal cord." Roderick simply closed his eyes, his massive hands gripping the edges of the heavy stone hearth to anchor himself. Isolde clamped the iron tongs securely around the thick, protruding base of the highest shard. She took a deep breath, bracing her bare feet against the freezing floor. 1, 2, 3. With a sharp, violent yank she pulled. Roderick unleashed a deafening, earth-shattering roar that shook the very foundation of the Dreadfort. The sound was so immense, so filled with raw, unadulterated torment, that Isolde's ears rang loudly. Black blood, thick and coagulated with dark magic, spurted from the open wound, hissing as it hit the cold stone. The shard came free with a sickening squelch. Isolde tossed the toxic metal aside. It clattered loudly against the far wall, leaving a trail of smoking, dark residue. Instantly, Isolde pressed the damp linen tightly against the wound, applying maximum pressure. Roderick was panting heavily, sweat pouring down his face, completely soaking his dark, matted hair. 1 down. She whispered, her hands shaking violently now that the adrenaline was beginning to peak. 2 left. The second extraction was even worse. The shard had hooked into the bone. As Isolde twisted and pulled the tongs, Roderick's control momentarily slipped. His eyes flashed a deadly feral red, and his massive body convulsed, his powerful arm swinging blindly backward. The back of his hand clipped Isolde's shoulder, sending her flying backward. She crashed hard against the heavy oak leg of the bed, the wind completely knocked from her lungs. "Isolde!" Roderick choked out the red fading back to amber as he realized what his body had done. Panic and deep remorse flooded his scent. "I'm fine," she gasped, forcing herself up, ignoring the intense throbbing pain in her shoulder. She scrambled back to him, refusing to let the moment pass. The extraction had partially dislodged the second shard. Without hesitating, she grabbed it with the tongs and ripped it completely free. More black blood spilled down his back, but the sickening silver glow in his veins was already beginning to visibly dim. By the time she clamped onto the third and final shard, Roderick was barely conscious. His massive body was trembling with exhaustion. Isolde pulled the last piece of iron free, tossing it away, before collapsing onto the floor beside him. She immediately pressed the remaining clean linen to his wounds, her hands slick with his blood. As the final trace of the poisoned metal left his body, a miraculous transformation began. The chaotic, jagged scars on Roderick's chest and arms, wounds that had refused to heal because of the constant circulating poison, suddenly began to knit together. The dark, sickly pallor of his skin flushed with healthy, vibrant warmth. The oppressive, terrifying scent of madness in the room evaporated, replaced entirely by the rich, intoxicating aroma of dark pine and crisp ozone. Roderick rolled onto his back, his chest rising and falling in deep, rhythmic, unobstructed breaths. He opened his eyes. They were no longer the fractured red of a mad beast, nor the desperate amber of an animal in pain. They were a striking, piercingly clear shade of deep forest green. He looked at Isolde, really looked at her, seeing the tattered dress, the bruised wrists from her chains, and the blood on her hands. Slowly the king reached up his massive, warm hand, gently cupping her face. The bond snapped into place with the force of a tidal wave, a golden thread of pure magic, tying their souls together. "My mate," Roderick whispered, his voice deep, smooth, and achingly tender. "You saved me." The blizzard outside raged on through the night, but inside the royal bedchamber, the atmosphere had completely shifted. For the first time in 5 agonizing years, King Roderick's mind was his own. He sat on the edge of the massive 4-poster bed, holding Isolde close to his chest, wrapping her securely in thick, luxurious furs, to banish the chill from her bones. As the fire slowly began to die down to glowing embers, they traded their stories. Isolde detailed the betrayal of her father, Lord Reginald, and how he had callously sold her to the Dreadfoot to secure territorial borders. Roderick listened in silence, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle ticked furiously in his cheek. Then it was the king's turn. Roderick revealed the dark truth that had plagued his reign. 5 years ago, my royal advisor, Chancellor Montgomery, presented me with a ceremonial cloak as a tribute from the Southern Covens. Roderick explained, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The moment I put it on, the iron shards embedded in the collar pierced my spine. Montgomery framed the Covens, declaring a false war to distract the kingdom, while I was locked away, slowly losing my mind to the poison. Isolde gasped, putting the pieces together. The brides, the noble Omegas they sent to you. Roderick closed his eyes, a look of profound grief washing over his handsome features. I never touched them. I was chained to the wall in my beast form, completely out of my mind with agony. Montgomery murdered them. He snapped their necks and sent them back to their families in sealed coffins, using their deaths to solidify my reputation as the Mad King. It kept the surrounding packs terrified and compliant, while Montgomery secretly ruled the kingdom from the shadows. And my father, Isolde deduced, the sickening realization hitting her. Lord Reginald is a coward, but he is greedy. Montgomery must have struck a deal with him. Offer the exiled Omega as the next victim, and in exchange, the Silverpine Pack gets a cut of the kingdom's northern territories. Roderick's eyes flashed with a dangerous golden light. His inner wolf, now fully healed and perfectly in sync with his human mind, was howling for the blood of those who had harmed his mate. They thought they were sending a lamb to a monster, Roderick whispered, pressing a tender, reverent kiss to Isolde's forehead. They didn't realize they were delivering a queen to her king. Dawn broke over the obsidian crags, casting a cold, pale light through the high, arched windows of the fortress. In the grand hallway outside the royal chambers, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed loudly against the stone. Chancellor Montgomery, a tall, elegantly dressed man with a sneering, arrogant face, walked toward the heavy oak doors, accompanied by 4 heavily armed guards. In his hands, he carried a ceremonial silver key. A smug smile played on his lips. He was fully expecting to open the doors, find the torn remains of the Silverpine Omega, and use the gruesome scene to finally declare the king completely feral, paving the way for his own official ascension to the throne. "Prepare the burial shroud," Montgomery instructed his guards dismissively. "Let us clean up the Mad King's latest mess." Montgomery slid the heavy silver key into the lock. He turned it with a loud clack, grabbed the iron ring, and confidently pushed the massive oak doors open. The smug smile instantly froze on his face. The chamber was not a bloodbath. There was no mangled corpse. Instead, standing in the very center of the room, fully bathed in the morning light, was King Roderick. The king was not hunched over feral or chained. He stood towering and majestic, fully dressed in his royal black leather tunic, the crest of the Blood Moon Pack gleaming proudly on his chest. His posture was commanding his aura, radiating such an overwhelming, suffocating wave of alpha authority that the 4 heavily armed guards instantly dropped to their knees, their wolves involuntarily submitting to their true ruler. But what truly paralyzed Montgomery with absolute terror was the woman standing confidently at the king's side. Isolde wore a heavy cloak of royal velvet, and Roderick's arm was wrapped protectively around her waist. The unmistakable potent scent of a fully mated, deeply bonded royal couple filled the air. "My king," Montgomery stammered, all the color draining from his face as he took a terrified step backward. "You are cured," Roderick finished for him, his voice booming through the cavernous hall like thunder. "Sane aware of exactly what you have done for the past 5 years. Montgomery, waho." Montgomery turned to run, but Roderick was faster. Moving with the blinding speed of a true alpha, the king crossed the room in a fraction of a second. He grabbed Montgomery by the throat, lifting the traitor effortlessly off the ground. The Chancellor kicked and choked his hands, futilely clawing at Roderick's iron-like grip. "You poisoned me," Roderick growled, his eyes glowing fiercely. "You murdered innocent women to fuel your own power, and last night you tried to sacrifice my mate." Roderick threw Montgomery violently to the floor. The guards remained kneeling, keeping their heads bowed in absolute submission to their rightful king. "Lock him in the deepest dungeon," Roderick commanded the guards, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. "And send my armies to the Silverpine Pack. Lord Reginald is to be arrested for high treason. The era of the Mad King is over." Isolde stepped forward, resting her hand on Roderick's strong arm. The court would soon learn that the weak, exiled Omega they had so carelessly thrown away was now the most powerful woman in the realm. The reign of terror had ended. And as Roderick looked down at his beautiful, brave queen, they both knew that their true story was only just beginning. Did you expect that shocking twist from a sacrificed Omega to the savior of the realm? Isolde proved that true strength isn't always about fangs and claws. If you loved this intense, heart-stopping werewolf romance and want to uncover more dramatic stories of betrayal, power, and fated mates, hit that like button. Right now, don't forget to share this video with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more epic, real-life inspired storytelling. See you next time.